Today, we're diving into a geopolitical earthquake, Canada's incredibly risky pivot away from its oldest ally and toward its greatest rival. It's a story about a single speech that may have just changed the world. Picture this, January 2026, the World Economic Forum in Davos. The room is buzzing. And then, US President Donald Trump steps up and delivers a stunning public smackdown to the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney.
Today, Canada and China have reached a preliminary but landmark trade agreement to remove trade barriers and reduce tariffs. By building this new strategic partnership, a strategic partnership for current realities, we're creating the stability and certainty that's needed for new investment and opportunities for our workers.
It wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a direct personal shot, fired for the whole world to see. A moment that just completely froze international diplomacy. So you've got to ask yourself, what on earth did Prime Minister Carney say just a day earlier to set this whole thing off? I mean, what line could you possibly cross to make a US president that openly hostile to his country's closest neighbor and ally? Well, the answer here isn't just about some more of words. No, this goes way deeper. We're talking about a fundamental shift in global power, a high-stakes gamble that could literally tear up the map of North American trade and alliances as we know it. Okay, let's get into it. To really understand that explosion in Davos, we've got to rewind a little and look at the speech that lit the fuse. Some people have called it a eulogy for American leadership, basically a declaration that the old rules are dead and gone. So Kanye gets up in front of this packed hall and he lays out a pretty stark new reality. He's basically saying, look, for decades, countries like Canada have counted on a predictable world, but that world, it's over. He said the big powers are now using the economy as a weapon, throwing tariffs around and turning supply chains into tools of control. It was a clear shot at the unpredictable, aggressive new world we're all living in. And you really have to understand why he felt he had to say this. I mean, just look at the numbers. In 2024, a mind-boggling 75% of all Canadian exports went to one single country, the United States. That's not just a trade relationship, that's an economic lifeline. And when that lifeline starts to feel a lot more like a leash, you have a real crisis on your hand. And that's exactly what was happening. This wasn't just talk, things were escalating, and fast. In April 2025, boom, new US tariffs hit Canadian cars. Then, just before the summit, President Trump comes right out and says the US doesn't need Canadian products. Add to that this bizarre, threatening push to buy Greenland, which rattled everybody in the Arctic. The message for Canada was loud and clear. Your best friend is fast becoming your biggest problem. So you're backed into a corner by a hostile neighbor, and the whole world order seems to be falling apart. What do? Well, Canada made a move that absolutely nobody saw coming. A strategy we can call the boreal realignment, a shocking and dramatic pivot to the east. So what does this big pivot actually look like? Well, just a few days before his Davos speech, Prime Minister Carney was quietly in Beijing, putting the final touches on a massive new deal. On one side, Canada agreed to reverse its 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. In return, China slashed its absolutely crippling 85% tariffs on Canadian canola all the way down to 15%. They also got rid of duties on things like seafood, and this is a big one. They renewed a massive currency swap, which is basically a way to do business without using the US dollar. And the immediate impact of this thing, it's huge. The Canadian government figures that just by reopening these markets, this deal is going to unlock nearly $3 billion in new exports for businesses and farmers. For a crop like canola, which had been totally devastated by the trade war, this was a desperately needed lifeline. And this wasn't just some short-term band-aid. Not at all. Both countries laid out a whole long-term roadmap. They're talking about restarting high-level talks, working together on green tech, and rolling out the welcome mat for new investment. This is about building a whole new economic foundation, one that's designed to last. So you're probably thinking, this sounds insanely risky. And you're not wrong. But this wasn't some panicked, spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a calculated gamble, and it's all based on a completely new way of looking at Canadian foreign policy. They're calling it values-based realism. I know it sounds a little academic, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It means you stick to your core values, like independence, but you have to be super pragmatic about how you protect them. It's about realizing you have to deal with the world as it is, not as you wish it were, if you want to stay in control of your own destiny. It's a huge break from the past. And Carney himself put it very bluntly. Back in Davos, he basically said that for countries like Canada, Doing nothing is not an option. The world is changing whether we like it or not. So the only real question is how you adapt. Do you just build walls and hope for the best? Or do you take bold action to carve out your own path? Well, Canada chose action. But as you can imagine, this bold action immediately kicked up a massive storm of controversy and confusion. The reaction to Canada's pivot was, well, it was chaotic, it was divided, and it was full of contradictions, both at home and across the border. Let's start with Washington, because the response there was all over the map. On one hand, you had President Trump himself telling reporters, yeah, the deal's okay. But at the exact same time, behind the scenes, his top officials were furious. His trade rep called it problematic. His transportation secretary warned that Canada would surely regret it. I mean, the mixed signals were just sending everyone for a loop. And the deal pretty much split Canada right down the middle, too. Out in the prairie provinces, which are all about agriculture, this was seen as a huge win. Premiers were celebrating. But then you go to Ontario, the heart of Canada's auto industry, and you hear a totally different story. Unions were warning that letting in tens of thousands of subsidized Chinese EVs could absolutely devastate their industry and cost thousands of jobs. And beyond all the economic arguments, there were these huge, looming questions about security. Critics pointed out that modern electric cars are basically computers on wheels, and they were asking, are we just inviting surveillance platforms onto Canadian roads? The government promised security guardrails, but they were pretty vague on the details. And all of this is happening with the memory of 2018 still fresh, when China detained 2 Canadians, proving it's more than willing to use people as political levers. So let's zoom out for a second, because this deal isn't really just about Canada. It's a symptom, and maybe even a cause of a much bigger breakdown of the global order. It's a flashing red light that the old alliances we took for granted are just not guaranteed anymore. And if you want to know how Beijing saw this whole thing, well, they weren't subtle about it. Chinese state media called it a massive strategic victory. They painted this picture of Canada, a core G7 nation and America's closest friend, finally breaking away from Washington. For them, this wasn't about trade. This was yet another brick in the collapse of the American empire. The immediate fallout from all this is that the upcoming review of the North American Free Trade Deal, the USMCA, is no longer just a routine check-in. It's now set to be a major flashpoint. The US is incredibly worried that this deal gives China a wedge to drive between the allies, maybe even a back door into the entire North American market. Trust me, that renegotiation is going to be an absolute battleground. And just to really hammer home the scale of the gamble Canada is taking here, look at this. In 2024, Canada's trade with the US was over $900 billion. With China, it was just $119 billion. Even with this new deal, bridging a gap that big is, well, it's a monumental task. Canada is betting its entire future on diversifying away from a relationship that's nearly 8 times bigger than its next closest partner. Which really brings us to the final critical question. In this messy new world, has Canada's big pivot really charted a bold new course for its own independence? Or, in a desperate attempt to get away from an unpredictable Washington, has it just jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire with a partner that could be even more complicated? One thing is for certain, the game is changing. For Canada, and really for the entire world, the old maps just don't apply anymore. Thanks for watching The Explain.